I'm really thrilled to be talking to about the Russia-Ukraine war to you guys. This is one of my favorite topic areas, and I think it's probably one of the most crucial ones to understand at a really deep level for both international and domestic extent. So I'm really excited to lecture about it for you guys today. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. If you don't know me from coaching earlier this week, my name is Sophia Amundgaard. I'm a rising senior from Stillwater, Minnesota, and I've been competing in International Extemp since my freshman year. Some really brief highlights of my career. I was a NIETOC semifinalist and the first seed out of prelims. I was also an ETOC finalist, which is where you see that trophy in my hands in the picture. And then this year, I placed 7th at NSDA in International Extemp. So hopefully I'm credible enough to be talking to you guys about this topic, and I really hope you'll enjoy the lecture. I want to just dive into a really quick agenda, but before I do, I want to preface that this lecture is for your educational and extemp experience. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute. I just ask that you ask them kind of in that in-between natural pause between the slides. So again, feel free to unmute whenever. I don't have access to the chat, but if you can't unmute and have any questions, just pop them in there and I'll address them at the end once I stop screen sharing. So I'm going to just go over a really brief agenda. We're going to start with some general knowledge and a history of the war in Ukraine, when it started and when it transformed from a conflict to a full-blown war. Then we're going to look at a quick example of where things currently stand before diving into some crucial developments and addressing the future of the war. So first and foremost, I want to offer you all a very brief history of the war in Ukraine. But before I do, I want to stress that this conflict has decades and decades of context, and everything I will be offering you will be more useful if you do your own independent research into understanding even more of the context behind this war. Because again, there is decades and decades of it. But in order to really understand what I'm going to explain today, we actually need to go all the way back to 2013, when then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych rejected a bid from the European Union to increase their economic involvement. And this would have put Ukraine onto a track to EU membership. But Yanukovych didn't do that. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of protesters filled the streets in Ukraine. So much so that by February of 2014, Yanukovych was actually forced to flee the nation entirely. But understand that Yanukovych was actually a Russian ally at the time and had a lot of support for the Russian Federation. So when he left the country, he left in his wake a wide open, unprotected block of land that his Russian allies very quickly swarmed to involve themselves in. So just a month later, Russian special forces began to take control of a piece of land known as Crimea. And Crimea is located in the Black Sea between Russia and Ukraine, and it's been long contested since the dissolving of the USSR. But it isn't until March 16th of 2014 that Russia officially annexes Crimea. And what this essentially means is that they claim Crimea as their own land. And this wasn't entirely uncontested. In fact, the majority of Ukrainians living in Crimea actually had a large ethnic Russian background. And the majority of them had in the past voted in favor of actually joining the Russian Federation. So the two reasons that Russia gave for its annexing of Crimea, or its justifications, was that there was a high ethnic Russian population there that had voted in favor of actually becoming part of the Russian Federation. And the second justification was that Russia had an obligation to protect these civilians from the hundreds of thousands of protesters that were currently flooding the streets in Ukraine. So that's how Russia justified this conflict. But the annexation of Crimea sparked an even longer lasting conflict that leads up right until December of 2021. And that almost decade of armed conflict was rather unrecognized by the international community. In fact, Russia denied that it was even in Crimea for a very, very, very long time. But why December of 2021 is so crucial is because it was just the year prior when the United States significantly upgraded their satellite technology. And this allowed them and the Biden administration to clearly see that Russia was in Crimea and confront Vladimir Putin about his positioning there. Which is why in December of 2021, Putin actually makes a series of demands to the United States and NATO. Because once the Biden administration accepted and acknowledged that there was a war ongoing, or at least an unofficial armed conflict, they started sending funding to Ukraine and protecting it. So in December of 2021, Russia demands a series of things. But before I list them out, I want to preface that when the USSR was dissolved, the way that Ukraine was able to maintain access and control over their nuclear facilities was if they promised they would never join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a democratic Western organization dedicated to peacekeeping and democracy, specifically in Europe. And so Ukraine agreed never to join NATO. However, they had been on track for a very long time to be involved with the organization. So in 2021, after the Biden administration confronts Vladimir Putin about his conflict in Ukraine and specifically Crimea, Russia makes a series of demands. And those are one, that Europe withdraw all of its military support for Ukraine immediately, and two, that Ukraine promise they will never join NATO. And this would be a reiteration of the promise they already made. But the US and NATO reject both of these demands and instead threaten the Russian Federation with economic sanctions. However, it isn't until February 24th of 2022 that Vladimir Putin officially announces his invasion of Ukraine, or as he calls it, his special military operation. And up until now, against all odds, Ukraine still stands as a sovereign nation with support from the international community. So now that we understand a really brief and condensed history of the war in Ukraine, we're going to understand and comprehend where Ukraine currently stands and where Russia stands as well. So today is day 1162 of the war in Ukraine. And Ukraine is still beating the odds. In fact, when Russia initially announced their invasion, those from Putin's inner circle said that Putin believed the war would last a maximum of 2 weeks. And clearly it's lasted much longer than that. But that has come with costs for Ukraine. However, it's Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky who has really been the leader in beating the odds. He's unified his country and maintained a strong internal support, but he's also done a lot to bolster its military. Although Ukraine has spent more than 37% of its GDP on this conflict, it's received more than $407 billion in aid from the international community. And the vast majority of that has come from international nations, not organizations, most notably the United States. But rather than forcing Ukraine to backtrack its progress in army development because it's actively in a conflict, this aid actually helped Ukraine skyrocket to be one of the world's strongest military presences in history. In fact, in 2021, before the war officially began, Ukraine had the 8th ranked army in Europe. And now it is the 2nd ranked army in Europe, second only, of course, to the Russian Federation. But it's 4 times larger than the next biggest military in the region, meaning that Ukraine actually hasn't suffered as many casualties or losses as the general media will report. And furthermore, by 2026, it's estimated that their military will actually be at 35 times the capacity it was than it was in 2022. So, although the general media will report that Ukraine is in a terrible position, and they are because they're actively in war, they're actually doing a lot better and improving almost every single day. So, hope is not lost. However, the same can't necessarily be said for the Russian Federation. Russia hasn't spent that significant portion of their GDP on the war in Ukraine. However, it has cost them more than $1 trillion, which is something their fatalized economy can't really support. But even more crucially, although Ukraine has received a lot of international aid, 79% of the world has a negative view of Vladimir Putin and his policies. And this has led Russia to become internationally isolated. But even more crucially, their military losses have been astronomical, even compared to Ukraine. In fact, they're 15 times larger than the USSR lost in the entirety of the 10 years war in Afghanistan. meaning that their military is like far gone. And this is because Russia is utilizing what is known as a meat grinder tactic. Essentially, the soldiers that they're releasing to fight in the war aren't really super high trained or skilled, but there's just such a large sheer number of them that they overwhelm Ukraine. And this is something Russia's been able to do for a long time because they're deploying more and more untrained civilians to fight in the conflict. Because it doesn't matter if they're trained or not. If there's so many of them that Ukraine can't fight them off, Russia's able to maintain its positioning. And that's exactly what it's doing despite its economic losses. Now, overall, we need to understand not just where things stand between the two countries individually, but where they stand in the broader conflict. So, Ukraine has had some major successes recently. In fact, they've liberated half of the land that Russia had taken from them at the beginning of the war, including some major wins in 2025 already. But it was in 2024 when Ukraine made probably one of the most historic advances in this conflict. And that was when they crossed the border into the Kursk region in Russia, where they still maintain a significant force of fleets and drones there. However, as I'll talk about later, Ukraine is also using a drone military tactic that is making it one of the strongest militaries and presences even able to combat Russia. And one of the most obvious ways it's done this was by forcing all naval fleets from the Russian Federation out of Crimea, which is probably one of the largest advances made in this war at all. So Ukraine isn't doing as bad as media reports it to be. But Russia isn't necessarily doing that poorly either. In fact, they currently occupy 20% of Ukraine, which is a significant portion of an already small nation. And they're starting to develop a series of highly technological advancements under their war economy. But nonetheless, they're still also starting to become under attack, as drone attacks, most notably in Moscow, have come from Ukraine, reaching the deepest that any Ukrainian attacks have ever been in Russia. And even more crucially, in Ukraine, Russia's troops are slowing. In fact, since March, they've been the slowest they have been in the entire conflict. And it's at this pace that the Atlantic Council predicts if Russia continues at this pace, it will take them 100 years to conquer Ukraine. But that's being kind of optimistic because Russia isn't just slowing now, it's on a path to slow for a very long time, meaning that although they occupy a significant portion of Ukrainian land, they aren't ever going to fully occupy Ukraine unless something major happens. So both nations are kind of in a stalemate. And this is a question you'll get a lot in Extemp. I think the best way to answer it is yes, because every single day, positioning will change. But overall, both nations are somewhat locked where they are. However, it isn't to say that Putin is entirely isolated from the international community, because he has gained two critical allies that have given him a leg up. And that is North Korea's Kim Jong-un and China's Xi Jinping. First, starting in China, China has been a crucial ally for Russia. In fact, it's its largest to date. But the reason the two nations have become so close is actually because of the United States. See, in 2022, the US and the European Union launched the largest ever packet of energy sanctions on any nation in history on Russia. And if you know anything about the Russian economy, it's almost entirely dependent on its energy sector. But these sanctions cap the price of oil per barrel from $70, what it was in 2021, to $47.60 in 2025, making a significant decrease in revenue for the Russian Federation. However, it wasn't just that Russia couldn't find anybody to export to, because they did find partners in both India and China. And as a result, Russia has now become the second most dependent nation on the Chinese economy, with a 63% increased dependence on Xi Jinping's policies and his economic kindness to the nation. As a result, many economists and analysts are predicting that Russia could very much and very soon become a hermit economy dependent on China. And this is what North Korea has done for decades. However, it's the first time that the Russian Federation would be entirely reliant on another nation. So it marks a huge landmark in history. But it also poses a long term dilemma for both nations post war. Understand that Russia is losing a lot of money on its trade deal with China, and China is getting some of the cheapest oil around the world. But also understand that the Russian economy is doing so poorly already that at the end of the war, whether it favors or doesn't favor Russia, their economy is going to be obliterated. And there is going to come a time when they will need to raise their prices. However, if they are so dependent on China and Xi Jinping's policies, that might not be an option. Which is why many analysts are saying, even post war, even if Russia is able to occupy the entirety of Ukraine, they might never recover. In fact, the real winner of this conflict could, in the long run, be China, because the authoritarian world is practically bowing down to them, at least economically. And I know we went on a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but it's really important to understand that Xi Jinping has a lot of leverage in this conflict, more than many people assume. And so, although it is technically a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's also more of a proxy conflict between the authoritarian leadership and the democratic leadership. But the second major ally that Russia has gained is Kim Jong un and North Korea. But this relationship has looked a little bit different than that of China. Instead of being an economic one, it's almost a purely military one. In fact, for the first time since 1953, North Korean boots have been on European soil because North Korea has deployed more than 30,000 troops to fight in the conflict. And this is significant for a plethora of reasons, but most notably because this is one of the first times since the 2016 Kim Trump summits that North Korea has done anything involving any other country than China and Russia. So, them sending troops to fight in the conflict is a significant turn in history. But these troops aren't necessarily super successful. In fact, they were removed entirely from the front lines because they were so poorly trained. And as a result of compromising Russia's front lines, they also comprised one half of all the casualties between North Korea, Russia, and Ukraine for the 2 months during which they were deployed. And now that they're all back home in North Korea, or the majority of them, it's clear they actually didn't do a lot to help Russia. But nonetheless, North Korea is also providing Russia with 70% of the artillery they're using in the war. So they're still a super strong ally to Russia and one that they're reliant on. However, the biggest implication of the 30,000 troops being deployed to Russia isn't for North Korea or Russia or even Ukraine. It's actually for South Korea. And I'm really passionate about this topic because this is exactly what my ETOC final was on. But essentially, South Korea and North Korea have long been in indirect conflict. However, the biggest thing that North Korea has had under their belt was nuclear weaponry and a strong international presence, or at least a strong fear on an international stage. However, now that North Korea has both wasted the majority of its troops, who are now dead, but it's also shown that its troops weren't that strong or powerful in the first place, meaning that it's one, less likely to attack South Korea anytime soon, but two, less likely to do well in attack against South Korea because they don't have the power to do well in the first place. So this should send a very strong message to South Korea and the rest of the international community. But nonetheless, it still shows the Western world that North Korea is committed to protecting Russia. But Russia isn't the only one who has had some interesting relationships over the course of this conflict, because Ukraine has also been struggling with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that I already mentioned, because they're trying to join it, but they really can't. No, the reason that Ukraine wants to join NATO is for what is known as Article 5 protection. Article 5 essentially posits that an attack on one member nation is an attack on everybody else who is a NATO member. And this is a really good thing for Ukraine and for any other member state. See, although Russia claims one of the reasons it attacked Ukraine was because Crimea has a large ethnic Russian population, there are actually other states in the Baltic region that have an even higher ethnic Russian population, most notably Lithuania and Latvia. However, the reason, or one of the major reasons, that Russia hasn't invaded those nations in the past is because they're NATO members and they have Article 5 protection. That is the exact same protection Ukraine would have if it became a NATO member, which would essentially pose Russia against the United States, both of which have access to a large nuclear base. And Vladimir Putin may be impulsive, but he isn't necessarily dumb. He understands what mutually assured destruction is. And he wouldn't engage in a direct war between Russia or Ukraine. Or at least we can be almost certain that he wouldn't. So the reason that Article 5 protection is so important to Ukraine is because it would practically do enough to almost stop the war, or at least force Russia into concessions. However, in order for them to actually join NATO, they need to do a series of things. First, they need to uphold the North Atlantic Treaty, also known as the Washington Treaty, which has a series of requirements, and some that Ukraine is fulfilling, but the majority that they aren't. And the two that they aren't fulfilling is democracy and war. And I'll talk about democracy a little bit later. But essentially, the Washington Treaty posits that a nation entering NATO can't actively be in the middle of conflict because that would trigger Article 5 immediately and put every other NATO member at risk. So Ukraine literally can't join the war right now unless a unanimous decision is made by all NATO members to allow it to join NATO. However, that decision hasn't yet been reached. And the most obvious reason why is because Ukraine isn't really democratic. In fact, it's been 6 years since their last elections in 2019, meaning that Volodymyr Zelensky's term has technically expired. And because they're currently under martial law, they're actually not a democracy. They're a hybrid regime, even if they have democratic practices. But those democratic practices, even though they might have been on track to being established before 2022, still aren't fully present. In fact, on the Freedom Index, Ukraine only receives a 51 out of 100, meaning that freedom of speech and expression are significantly burdened in the nation. And additionally, just a couple weeks ago, Volodymyr Zelensky tried to pass a bill that would essentially ban all anti corruption bodies, or ACBs, which is a blatant red flag for any democratic nation. And although this failed to actually pass unanimously, it still shows that Ukraine really isn't there when it comes to its democratic fortitude. But nonetheless, NATO has still posited that Ukraine is on an inevitable track to NATO membership. But this track can only be fulfilled post-war. So what's critical to understand is that although Volodymyr Zelensky will likely continue to lobby for NATO membership, he probably won't get it until the war is over. And this marks a significant turning point in Western support for Ukraine. Because for a long time, in fact, since the early 2000s, NATO has been practically begging Ukraine to join them. And Ukraine has been on a path to do so. But this is a serious disruption in that path, and one that likely won't be mended for a very, very long time. However, there is one leader, both in and outside of NATO, who has played a significant role in the war in Ukraine, and that is US President Donald Trump. Now, his diplomacy has been a roller coaster for both nations, but we're going to start with Ukraine. Essentially, in March of 2025, as Trump entered his second term as US president, the Trump administration paused all aid to Ukraine. And this was the first time that a complete pause had meant detriment for any type of resource going to Ukraine from the United States. And understand that the United States is Ukraine's top military humanitarian and monetary supporters. So this had major disruptions, which is why Donald Trump almost rightfully assumed that pausing this aid would force Ukraine into negotiations with Russia. But he was wrong. And as a result, Trump was only angered by Ukraine's lack of response to these concessions. In fact, in a meeting at the White House, Trump and JD Vance asserted that Zelensky was a dictator. And in this very unproductive meeting, they also made fun of him for not wearing a suit. So for a long time, Ukraine and the United States were no longer as close as they once were. However, it seems like at least the Trump administration is backtracking on that entirely because just earlier this year, the Trump administration signed a minerals deal with Ukraine, which gives them access to 22 out of 34 of the world's most valuable minerals and natural resources for the defense industry. And this is crucial for a numerous amount of reasons, but most notably because the Trump administration has been implementing a tariff war on countries all over the world. So they're not getting the same kind of resources, especially mining resources, that they once were, because nations can't afford to give them those anymore. But the other reason it's so important is because this deal establishes a joint investment fund, essentially meaning that Ukraine has to share 50% of the revenue they make off of their minerals with the United States, which gives Trump more than enough incentive to protect Ukraine at all costs, because Ukraine has a very profitable minerals industry, or they did before 2022. So now the Trump administration has more than enough reason to protect Ukraine and to ultimately get it to a place where the war is no longer occurring. However, the same cannot be true for Trump's diplomacy with Russia. Although it is kind of flipped. See, in February, Donald Trump approached Vladimir Putin and essentially stated that he was willing to accept the demands that Russia was making to Ukraine for concessions of land. In fact, he and JD Vance even went publicly and said the only way Ukraine will survive this war is if they concede the land they've already lost and then some, essentially posing themselves as almost enemies of Ukraine. However, this changed drastically when Vladimir Putin stopped being willing to negotiate at all. In fact, he almost entirely ignored Trump's calls for negotiations in the first place, which is why Trump gave Putin a 50-day deadline, which is expiring this week, to either stop the killings and negotiate or face his economic wrath and economic sanctions. However, Putin has not agreed to any of these measures, whether it's through ceasefire or anything else. And as a result, the Trump administration is exceedingly angry with Vladimir Putin and has begun to shift more and more towards Ukraine's side. But there's another facet of the war in Ukraine that we need to understand that has almost nothing to do with outside forces like the United States. And that is the military strategy that has been developed during this conflict, because it is revolutionary, most notably through drone warfare. Now, Ukraine was kind of a pioneer in this tactic. In fact, they've deployed more than 2 million drones in the war. And it's been really successful for them, most notably because drones are really cost effective. For Russia, it costs them to deploy a drone $350,000 per target. But for Ukraine, it's only $400 per FPV drone that they deploy, meaning they can kind of deploy endless drones. And this has been a successful tactic for them. In fact, drone warfare in Ukraine has allowed them to capture a third of all land that Ukraine has captured or alleviated at night, because at that time, it's far harder to detect any of the drones that cross any borders into Russia, which is why Ukraine has been able to launch those attacks on Moscow that I mentioned earlier. And it isn't just that they're unable to attack them at night. Drone warfare also carries with them a series of other benefits, both for Russia and Ukraine. First of all, Drones don't require human operators, meaning that for both nations whose militaries have shrunk significantly, they don't need to deploy as many people to fight in the conflict because they have robots and other tools essentially doing that work for them. So that's the first major development that drones offer. And they also offer cost effectiveness, as I already mentioned. But the third major one is that drones are like 5 times more responsive than humans are. In fact, their response time is significantly shorter, meaning that if something were to happen in their peripheral, they can respond in a much faster timeline than any human troops could, giving both sides a leg up, especially when fighting in heavily contested regions. Although Ukraine was the pioneer in drone warfare in the war in Ukraine, Russia is slowly catching up to them. In fact, of July of 2025, they hit a record number of drones deployed. And as Russia continues to develop their war economy, Russia is also investing in making their drones cheaper to operate. In fact, they've already cut thousands of dollars in drone development per drone in just the past 2 months that they've been heavily investing in it. So clearly, drone warfare has been revolutionary for the war in Ukraine for both parties. And as a result, I think if there's anything you should look into for your speeches, it's drone warfare because it's unique and it is the future of war, not just in Ukraine, but across the world. But finally, the question that everybody's been asking for years is peace even possible between Russia and Ukraine? And the answer is really, really complicated. And I'm sorry that I can't give you a direct one. But as Gallup reported, like literally just 7 hours ago, tides are changing for Ukraine and Russia. As of now, 69% of Ukrainians are actually willing to negotiate to end the war. And this is a stark difference between in 2022, when 73% of Ukrainians reported they were willing to fight to win the war, even if that meant losing their livelihoods. Essentially, Ukrainians are making the shift from being willing to fight and not being willing to negotiate to preferring to negotiate and lose land over maintaining the sovereignty and control of the regions they've already lost to Russia. And this is exactly what Vladimir Putin has wanted since 2014. But for some unknown reason, Russia is no longer satisfied with that. In fact, with Trump's deadline expiring on Friday, Putin has no intention to negotiate anytime soon with Ukraine, which essentially means that this conflict isn't going anywhere, which is disastrous for both parties. The Institute for the Study of War essentially puts it best when they say that Putin remains uninterested in ending his war. And this is true because at the beginning of the conflict, understand that Putin wasn't just protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine. He was also working to rebuild the Soviet Union, a claim he's made multiple times. So saying that he's uninterested in ending his war is actually a correct and statement we've known for a long time to be true. However, he's also attempting to extract bilateral concessions from the United States without meaningfully engaging in a peace process. This is what has changed since the beginning of the conflict. And so it's really critical that you understand Russia was once willing to negotiate if it meant expanding its territory reach, but now it is no longer willing to do so. And we can't really give a definitive reason as to why, other than that NATO has promised Ukraine is on a path to membership. And that path to membership threatens NATO expansion, that threatens Russia's autocratic regime. Ultimately, in the end, if peace is to be reached, it will have to be supported by the international community, which is another reason that it's unlikely in the next decade peace will be reached, because the United States is the only nation who is actively taking the front seat and driving these negotiations in the first place. But as a US envoy recently confirmed, Europe will not be a part of the Ukraine peace talks, which is infuriating for many European Union nations, most notably Germany, who has long been involved in supporting Ukraine. and even more notably, leading organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, who have worked with the United States very closely. But also considering that the war in Ukraine impacts Europe most notably, both through its distribution of resources like grain from Ukraine and energy through Russia, but also through the presence of armed conflict. Them not having a seat at the negotiation table is crucial. And it's also very telling because if the United States doesn't let Europe help in negotiations, it's unlikely that Ukraine and Russia will be willing to negotiate in the first place. And this will ultimately result in what we have today, which is a stalemate between both nations. And to be clear, when I say stalemate, I don't necessarily mean that one nation hasn't occupied more land than the other. What I mean is that neither are willing to negotiate to the extent that the other wants. And so as a result, they're fighting back and forth and likely will be for a very long time. Because remember that Atlantic Council report, at the current rate that Russia is going, it will take them a century to entirely conquer Ukraine, which ultimately means that if they slow down at all, it'll take them even longer. But considering that they're also not willing to negotiate and that their support from the international community is dwindling, it seems that they will be slowing down. And so this conflict might take a lot longer than the 2 weeks Vladimir Putin predicted. Ultimately, if there's anything you should take away from this lecture, I want it to be one, that you do a lot of research into understanding the background of this conflict even more, because it ranges back until the USSR and its dissolvement. But two, I want you to understand the true situation between these two nations, because they aren't just fighting over a piece of land, being Crimea, they're fighting over an ideology and the expansion of the Russian Federation, something that no nation other than Russia, China, and North Korea actually wants to happen. So, in order to predict the future of the war in Ukraine, which I'm convinced literally nobody can accurately do, we need to understand that both nations are likely going to be unwilling to negotiate to the extent the other wants for a very, very, very long time. And as a result, this war is likely going to be one that will last even longer. Thank you so much for listening to me. I saved about 15 minutes to ask questions because I know this is such a difficult and contested topic. So I'm going to stop screen sharing soon so I can address any questions in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to unmute. I'll answer them to the best of my abilities. Give me just one moment. Okay, and I will open my time to questions.
Okay, so actually with what you just talked about like a few minutes earlier, with like Europe not having a seat at the table, could that change with like a new administration or like yeah.
Certainly. So one of the reasons that Trump's diplomacy has been so contested is because he approaches it in a very different way than any other administration approaches diplomacy, whether that be the Biden administration, the Obama administration, or even the former 2016 Trump administration. So it is likely to change if the war is still ongoing when Trump ends his second term, which, as I've already mentioned, it's likely it will be. However, I would definitely predict that under the Biden administration or a future Democratic administration or Republican administration, that there would be a different approach to negotiations. And I think that the best approach to negotiations would be to involve Europe because Europe has been the one supporting Ukraine since day one, and they're the ones who can offer the concessions that Russia might be willing to accept. So I would say under a different administration, it's very, very, very likely that there would be a change in how negotiations are handled and in their success. I also see a question in the chat from Lily. Are numbers like the freedom scale viable citations in speeches? Or are there better ways to quantify things like freedom of speech, human rights, etc.? This is a great question. So in my extemp speeches, I absolutely cite things like the freedom scale index. I think that that's one of the best things to use, especially in your A subpoints, depending on the substructure you're using. However, I will say like always back that up with other empirical data or other evidence to prove that this claim is warranted. So essentially, if you're talking about the freedom index, you want to explain maybe something that Volodymyr Zelensky has done to decrease free speech or to not increase free speech. So one of the things I mentioned was his blocking of those anti-corruption bodies. So that's a great piece of evidence to bring along with it. But I would say citing those numbers are totally variable, especially if you cite the source and explain its credibility as well. Yeah, Melinda, what do you want to ask?
What would be required to have a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a direct answer for you, just because both nations kind of change their positioning very frequently. I can tell you what both countries have said they want. So, for a long time, Ukraine has said that they won't concede any land. As I mentioned, that is changing. 69% of Ukrainians are willing to negotiate, even if that means losing land in order to stop the war. But that isn't the same situation for Russia. So, the Russian Federation wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. That's what they've claimed. That's what Vladimir Putin has petitioned on for a very long time. But in order to do that, they need Ukrainian land. So I will say, from my experience and my research, many credible sources say Russia's endgame is almost complete domination of Ukraine. But that isn't really realistically going to happen unless the war goes on for a century, which would be pretty much impossible. So I'm going to tell you, in order for a peace deal to be reached, there need to be a lot of pressure on Russia, and Ukraine would need to be able to continue for quite some time at the pace they're going, if not a little bit stronger, in order for them to continue to deter Russia. Because right now, Ukraine is playing defense because they're not on the offense anymore, even if they do occupy a little bit of territory in Russia, because they're willing to negotiate. But we need to get Russia to a position where they're willing to negotiate without sacrificing that in Ukraine. So I hope that answers your question. It's a really hard one to answer just because their positionings are changing. If Ukraine was making the concessions they're offering to now, like 2 years ago, we might be looking at a very different negotiation process. But now it's going to be a lot harder to predict. Emma, what's your question?
Yeah, so I have a few. First, going back to that diplomacy thing, how come the US is the one handling it all anyway? Like, did Europe just say, like, oh, okay, like you can handle everything? Because I guess given how much they've, committed to Ukraine, like, why couldn't, like, the, I don't know, some other European nation, like, swoop in and say, like, hey, we'll organize negotiations and US, you can kind of just, like, sit there or something.
For sure. So this is a good question. And like again, I can't really give you a direct answer other than that Europe hasn't taken the front seat in negotiations, right? There hasn't been any country that's been like Putin, Zelensky, we need to sit down and discuss this directly. And the United States is like the world's biggest global superpower. So that is kind of a position that we've just held and exercised for a really long time. So because other countries haven't done the same thing, it's kind of intuitive that when the United States does it, they get a little bit more of a say, especially because they have a direct relationship with both Russia and Ukraine. And some other nations in Europe might not have that same seat at the table, if that makes sense.
I see. And then my other question was earlier, like you kept saying that Ukraine's not doing as bad as the media claims, but then why is the media claiming that like, oh, Ukraine's doing really bad? Like, do they have like some type of incentive to do that or?
Yeah, so the media is prone to reporting the worst aspects of a conflict, right? The things that make headlines aren't that Ukraine is surviving, it's that Ukraine just lost X amount of land, right? So I would say the media is reporting that Ukraine is making concessions or that Ukraine has alleviated 50% of what Russia has claimed since the beginning of the war. But that's not what makes the headlines, because what makes the headlines is what's changing really drastically. So, say Russia claims 4,000 miles of land like 2 weeks ago, that's what's going to make the headlines that everybody's going to read. So, because the news kind of is prone to just reporting things that will make headlines and things that are negative, that's what you'll see more frequently. But that's also why I encourage everybody to do really deep research, because you can find the truth and you can find things to compare as long as you put in the time and effort to do it.
Thank you.
For sure. Okay, I'm going to address some questions in the chat. Okay, is there a specific reason for why the US diplomacy in terms of the Trump administration is choosing this route or to not involve Europe? That's a really good question too. So I can't really give you a direct answer. The Trump administration functions really differently than any other administration. And Trump tends to like to handle negotiations in a way that will benefit him, in a way that he'll get something out of it. So a really good example is the Trump administration pressured Ukraine, right? They removed a lot of their aid, or at least paused their aid. And that caused Ukraine to kind of flail a little bit. So then when the Trump administration completely backtracks and offers them a minerals deal, Ukraine is like, yes, we'll do anything for you to give us back that military support, even if that means giving you 50% of the revenue we receive from our minerals, like mines. So I would say the Trump administration handles negotiations really differently. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's a selfish tactic, but it is a self serving tactic. So when Trump is approaching these negotiations, he wants to get the most out of them for the United States. And that's exactly what he's doing. So I can't tell you why necessarily other European nations aren't being involved, but I can tell you that Trump has his own agenda and he knows how he likes to handle things. And then the other thing that I can tell you is that the majority of Europe is in strong, strong, strong support of Ukraine, and they don't want Ukraine to make concessions. But Trump has essentially said that Ukraine will need to make concessions. So he doesn't want to work with other nations to try and negotiate who disagree with his stance. Okay, Lily, is the claim of wanting to rebuild the Soviet Union a guise for other goals like accessing minerals or holding claim to buffer states between Russia and Europe? Okay, this is a good question as well. So the answer is yes and no. The claim of rebuilding the Soviet Union will do a lot of things for Russia. It would give them access to new minerals. It would give them access to holding claim between Russia and Europe because they could build a claim, they could expand authoritarianism, right? So the Soviet Union has always historically kind of been the bad guy in Europe. And now that Ukraine has extended out of the Soviet Union and is becoming more democratic leading and on track to NATO membership, that is a threat to Russia. And even if Putin isn't on track to entirely rebuild the Soviet Union, that is essentially what he's aiming to do. And he can't do that when nations like Ukraine are leaning so far towards democracy, because that ruins his buffer between the strong democracy that's thriving in the rest of Europe. So I would say it is a combination of the two. The reason Russia wants to rebuild the Soviet Union is so that they can have those things. I guess if that makes sense. But yeah, great question. And Mira, you also answered that really well.
I want to ask for Ukraine-Russia speeches, what kind of sources do you like to use other than just basic sources like AP News, Reuters, that kind of stuff?
Really good question. My favorite is the Council on Foreign Relations. They do a global conflict tracker, which is great not just for Russia, Ukraine, but for any wars around the world because they offer you a really intensive background and then an update on recent like developments and then predictions for the future. So the Council on Foreign Relations is my favorite for the Russia-Ukraine war, especially when I'm trying to understand new concepts. Other than that, I love the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I think that's a super strong source. Al Jazeera also does a daily update. So this is like insanely helpful. Every single day, they release everything that happened that day during the war in Ukraine. So especially if you want to work on your SOS or your background, Al Jazeera is great because you can cite like an article that was published yesterday. And they always have really credible authors as well. So Al Jazeera is another one of my favorites. Honestly, I'll recommend to you like any think tanks are also going to be really helpful. So Carnegie, Council on Foreign Relations, CSIS, etc. And then any other scholarly articles. So anything from the Harvard Business Review is really helpful. Yale also has some really good articles. And then podcasts are another one of my favorites. So Reuters has a series of really, really good podcasts, Viewsroom, Econ World, Breaking News, that all generally discuss different aspects of the war in Ukraine in kind of scattered episodes. One makes you sound really smart to cite a podcast, but it also gives you kind of like an intensive breakdown of what's currently happening in the conflict. So I also recommend those.
So, like, what impacts could you use for Ukraine, Russia, other than just direct humanitarian ones?
Yeah, so it depends on the question you're answering, but I would say everything does circle back to the people. When you're answering a question and you're impacting an event, everything circles back to the people who are impacted. But for example, if we were talking about like the NATO bid, if that was one of your points, maybe in your A sub point you explain how like since the 2000s Ukraine and NATO have been in negotiations for Ukraine to join. And then maybe in your B sub point you're talking about why they can't join now. And then in your C sub point you can explain like why that's so significant. Either explain why Article 5 would be really helpful to Ukraine and why it's so bad that they don't have access to that, or explain like kind of like I did how until Ukraine reaches a democratic state, they can't join um, NATO. So, like, if that was your B sub point, then your C sub point, you could explain like they're not on track anytime soon to reach democracy because they're under martial law, and that means that they won't be able to join NATO for a very long time, or something like that. I hope that answers your question. It kind of isn't one size fits all with the Russia-Ukraine war because there are so many points that you can have, but I always encourage everybody that your impact should relate back to people in every sense possible. But also just think of them as why the point you're bringing up matters specifically, or why the impacts of your individual subpoints matter cumulatively in the context of the question. So I hope that's helpful. But yeah, I would always recommend you circle back to people and the humanitarian crisis. Obviously, don't be repetitive, but you can always give like a heart story or just explain like if it's a certain attack maybe that happened in a certain region of Crimea, who that impacts or who has been impacted or what could happen of that.
Yeah, another thing I want to ask is a really common IX question is like, is the Ukraine war going to end this year? Is it going to end within this time frame? What kind of points would you use for those kind of questions? Because I see them a lot in
Yeah,
IX.
for sure. No, those are definitely very common. I think the sentiment that I kind of gave y'all in this presentation was that it's likely not going to end anytime soon. So I think some really good points for this are one that Russia just isn't willing to negotiate. So the fact that Ukraine is now willing to make concessions, but Russia won't accept them, just inherently means that it's going to be impossible for them to negotiate, right? So I would say one of my first points is about like a lack of negotiation capacity. Another point that I would make is just that if we don't try and negotiate, the militaries aren't necessarily going to make significant gains or losses anytime soon. And I talked about that kind of in the beginning of my presentation when I explained specifically through that Atlantic Council source that it would take up to a century for, at the pace that they're currently going, the Russian Federation to occupy all of Ukraine. And then you can also cite how Ukraine is actually making advances in drone warfare, so they're also deterring Russia. So it's kind of this back and forth. So those are 2 points I think that you can use in almost any speech about that. Your third point might have to be a little bit more tailored, but yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Sorry, I didn't get your second point. Could you repeat that for the
Yeah,
Russia-Ukraine thing?
for sure. So my first point was about a lack of negotiation capacity. I think my second point would probably be a lack of like military advancement or the capacity for militaries to advance in one way or the other. And what I would talk about is how in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has been advancing. Like they have new technology in drone warfare that has been able to put them on the offense inside of Russia because they're reaching all the way to Moscow, right? So they actually are going decently strong. And then I would also talk about how that Atlantic Council source says that it could take a minimum of a century for Russia to invade or conquer all of Ukraine at the current pace they're going. And then explain that they're actually slowing down. So it's likely that it would take them even longer, if that makes sense. So what that essentially means is that neither military is going to be able to advance enough to entirely conquer the other or entirely defeat the other. And so that kind of creates that stalemate I was talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So it's just like it's really hard for one of them to like efficiently do anything without being severely backtracked.
Sure. I would just say, like, I think my first point would be about like a lack of negotiation capacity, and my second point would be about a military stalemate. Basically, both armies are at a similar like fortitude and have similar resources at this point.